Hello. In this video we will be debunking the chemtrail theories with some actual proven science. Heaven only knows why people believe such rubbish, but we will attempt to explain the science. Firstly, we will look at the jet engine, specifically the fuel it burns, and the byproducts it produces in the exhaust. Secondly, we will have a quick look at different states of water, i.e., solid, liquid and gas. The third subject will be to look at the atmosphere, specifically air saturation levels, and what happens to water absorption when air becomes 100% saturated. We will then put all this in place to describe how all these factors come together in the formation of condensation trails emanating from commercial jet aircraft. Fourthly, we will touch on short and persistent condensation trails, and the effects the latter can produce. We will even use information from tried, tested, and approved publications. Finally, we will have a bit of a laugh at some of the evidence the chemtrail nutters try and use to justify their beliefs. The jet engine is an integral part of the modern aircraft. There is a video on this channel describing how a jet engine operates, so we won't go into detail here. Suffice to say, fuel is burned in the combustion chamber, and the byproducts of that burning pass through the exhaust. The typical modern jet burns the fuel around 1700 degrees Celsius. This temperature is likely to destroy any chemtrail compound likely to be mentioned. The process of passing through various stages of turbines, the temperature of the exhaust will be approximately 600 degrees Celsius. Jet aircraft burn a refined type of kerosene, which is a hydrocarbon. Kerosene contains some additives to prevent gumming at low temperatures, but those additives are also likely to be hydrocarbons too. The chemical composition of kerosene is C12, H26, C15, H32. There are therefore lots of carbon and hydrogen elements, which will become important shortly. When hydrocarbon fuel is burned, the carbon and hydrogen elements, mentioned earlier, react with the oxygen in the atmosphere. This produces carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide is the concern of climate activists, but it is the water we will be looking at. Yes, it is correct to say that trace elements of other products are present, such as NO, N2O, and other elements. N2O is also known as laughing gas. However, to show how negligible the amounts are, there wouldn't even be enough N2O to raise a one-sided smirk. So, no chemtrails there. Modern jet airliners use high bypass engines, where at least 90% of the thrust comes from the forward fan. Because of this, the cold air from the fan helps to mix up the airflow, more so than older engines, which leads to a greater chance of ice crystals forming. If you don't take our word for it, there is a peer-reviewed scientific paper on the subject. Water is a basic compound, essential for all life, and is denoted chemically as H2O. Some, in jest, call it dihydrogen oxide, but if you think about it carefully, dihydrogen is H2, and oxide is O. This gives H2O. That clears up another chemtrail conspiracy theory. Now let's have a look at the properties of water, namely the three states water can be in. From basic chemistry, the three states of an element are known as solid, liquid, and gas. Water is no different. Ice is the solid state, ordinary water is the liquid state, and water vapor is the gaseous state. Water vapor is a colorless, invisible gas, which is demonstrated by this diagram of a kettle boiling. As you can see, there is a small gap between the spout and the beginning of the steam cloud. This is because the water leaves the kettle as vapor, but as it hits cooler surrounding air, the vapor condensates to liquid state, and becomes small water droplets, which we can now see. These water states, and the condensation effect, is important to remember for later in the video. Centuries of study has taken place on the atmosphere, and similarly, much study has been undertaken of meteorology. This is not new science, but well studied and well understood. However, in this video, we will look at saturation levels. We know from actual measurement that as you gain altitude, both the temperature and pressure of the air will decrease. Inversion layers etc. will have a bearing on that, as we may discuss later, but it is fair to accept that there will be an overall temperature and pressure drop when climbing from ground level to 38,000 feet. The equation to determine saturation is complex, and meteorologists out there will be able to give you the data in detail. In this video though, it is sufficient to say that saturation is dependent on temperature and pressure. In this example, which is based at a constant level, point B indicates that at 25 degrees Celsius, the air is just under 50% saturated for a given pressure. If the air is cooled, the amount of water the air can hold reduces, and as demonstrated in the line BC, the saturation increases until it reaches 100%. After that, no more water can be absorbed by the air, and as such any extra vapor condenses to produce water droplets or ice particles. Fog appears when the temperature drops below point C, and the excess water vapor condenses. Water content can be added to the air, which is demonstrated when warm air travels over an expanse of water, such as sea. The water evaporates and is held in the air as vapor. As more water is added, the percentage saturation increases, until it reaches 100%, as demonstrated by line BA. After that, no more water can be absorbed, and any further water vapor will condense. A decrease in pressure decreases the temperature at which the air reaches 100% saturation. As pressure decreases, vapor particles are pressed less closely together, thus decreasing the chance they will form into droplets. However, the pressure effects are a lot less prevalent than temperature effects. This is the basis on which condensation trails form. To recap, jet engines burn hydrocarbons and produce water vapor as a byproduct. If the air is significantly below 100% saturation, this water vapor will be absorbed into the atmosphere. This is why you don't see trails at lower altitudes where saturation levels are usually lower. Contrails are produced when the saturation levels are high, and the air can't absorb this water quickly, or not at all. The water vapor hits the cold air, and if not absorbed, will condense into water droplets. If those droplets can't be absorbed, the cold air will turn those droplets into ice crystals. This is the basis of condensation trails. If the saturation is at, say, 98%, the water vapor will condense and produce trails. But because the air isn't at 100% saturation, the ice crystals can then sublimate and be absorbed into the air. This is the reason short condensation trails exist. In this photo, you will notice a gap between the engine exhaust and the condensation trail. If you remember the kettle description earlier, there is a brief period where the water exists as vapor, which is a colorless gas. When the vapor condenses in the cooler air, it becomes visible as water, then ice particles. If the air becomes 100% saturated, the air cannot absorb the ice crystals, and therefore the condensation trails will persist. they will remain in the atmosphere as long as the air remains saturated. This can last over many hours, and during that time, wind and other effects can cause the trails to spread out, change direction, or even create differing patterns. The trails will not dissipate until the saturation levels of the local atmosphere reduces to below 100%. Meteorologists can predict when condensation trails will start in each area. The graph shown represents the condensation trail forecast for a region on a particular day and time. In this case, Cambridgeshire on the 10th of April 2020, at 1300 hours. The black line represents the forecast air temperature at a particular flight level, and the red line represents the critical air temperature for condensation trail formation, which takes into consideration expected saturation levels and air pressure at those flight levels. From this, we can assume that condensation trails will not form below flight level 315. Above that, we can see that between flight level 315 and flight level 340, any condensation trails formed are not likely to be persistent, and therefore the aircraft are likely to produce short trails. Between flight level 340 and flight level 400, it is likely the aircraft will produce persistent condensation trails, which may last many hours. Above flight level 400, the probability drops to short trails again. This is why you see some aircraft producing either small trails, or no trails, and others producing persistent trails in the same vicinity. It is because the aircraft, whilst in the same area, will be at different levels. Earlier we mentioned inversion layers. This is a phenomenon where the temperature can increase with altitude, and can occur for a variety of meteorological reasons. This can cause the aircraft to climb through a region where condensation trails are produced, and because the temperature then goes up, the air becomes unsaturated, causing the trails to stop. Once through the inversion layer, the temperature drops again, causing the air to become saturated, which allows the aircraft to produce trails again. This gives the illusion that the pilot is turning the trails off, and then on again. So as we see, the atmosphere regulates when condensation trails are formed, at what levels, and for how long. This diagram helps to explain much of what we have said. We shall leave it here for a few seconds for you to absorb. No pun intended. Many sources are used to try and bolster evidence of chemtrails, and we shall now go through some of those examples. The first, and possibly my favorite, are the photoshopped pictures. A lot of them were made by pilots being a little mischievous, but sadly the conspiracy theorists took them seriously. One of the best, and most used photo is of the chemtrail on-off switch on the overhead panel. However, with a small bit of investigation, the photo comes from the overhead panel of an Embraer 145 aircraft, and the switch is, in reality, the sterile light switch. This is a communication system between the flight deck and cabin crew. The next is the airman, standing next to tanks, apparently wearing a Team Chemtrail badge, which has very nicely been enlarged. Notice how the badge is perfectly enlarged with no pixelation. Unfortunately for the conspiracy theorists, the real photo is slightly different. Third on the list has to be the 737 panel that shows the chemtrail off, auto, and on switch, along with the turbo generator switch. It's such a shame it's only the no smoking and fasten seatbelt sign switches. Sometimes it comes along with the co-pilot eject button, if only it wasn't the emergency exit light arming switch. The second on the list are the water ballast tanks, which are described as the tanks filled with ghastly chemicals ready to spray us all. In the same breath, it's all secret and no one knows about it. In reality, they are ballast tanks used during aircraft testing. So secret in fact, that the public are allowed on board to take photos, and often do. There are plenty of official and reputable websites giving full information. There is one other point. If all these aircraft are creating all these chemtrails, how are the passengers traveling, and how are they being kept separate? The third subject has got to be the YouTube videos that are posted. Remember the pilot on the stand at Shasta County? It's a pity no one did any background checks on the witnesses. Or perhaps the YouTube video of Rosalind Peterson giving evidence to Congress. She later confirmed that there's no evidence that those trails in the sky are anything other than normal contrails. Or, how about CIA Director John O'Brien at the Council on Foreign Relations, admitting geoengineering in the form of stratospheric aerosol injection is taking place, i.e. chemtrails. Debunked. Similarly with Kristen Meghan. Fourthly, we must mention the cloud seeding conspiracy. Cloud seeding does happen, but there are things to note. It is regulated, requires a license to operate, and smaller aircraft are used to perform the operation. Of course, it has to be done over cloud, and not in clear blue skies. Fifth on the list is the statement that there are papers and patents filed on the subject of geoengineering, so therefore it must be happening. A lot of scientific papers have never been peer-reviewed, or remain as theoretical. It is also against international law to use geoengineering. As for patents, well, there are many that have never left the drawing board. Perhaps you've seen a urinal headrest in service, or better still, a calculate your life expectancy watch. Perhaps you should research what is actually in use before using them as proof. My final subject is reference to the intensity of the trails, and the call of it was never like that years ago. Those who live on active airways, particularly major routes and crossing points, can't be that surprised when a number of aircraft pass overhead in criss-cross patterns. With regards to the claim it didn't happen years ago, it is fortunate that avid photographers took photographs of it happening many years back. It was certainly noted when Allied bombers, who also burned hydrocarbon fuel, created condensation trails. Unless, of course, you believe bombers weren't bombing, they were chemtrailing instead. There are many other examples of conspiracy theories, but as this video has shown, it can all be debunked with actual true and scientific evidence. We can't let this video finish without mentioning probably the most used piece of evidence in this debate. The box was made as a joke, with many references printed on the box to give the hint. Unfortunately, some have not noticed these hints, so it is our duty to point them out. Firstly, the name. If you recall from earlier in the video, this is merely H2O, or plain old water. Secondly, the lot number, currently listed as FU idiot. There is a hint. To support that, another read the label opportunity appears. It says, "You are an idiot if you think this is real." Great hint. Finally, you may be fooled into thinking it is US government property. Well, as it says on the box, it's not. Are you getting the hint yet? That's the end of the video. We could have put a lot more material into it, but I fear it is still too long for some. Hopefully, There will still be a miracle out there, and someone will finally get the science and do their own reasoning. But then, pigs might fly. Goodbye.